good. I like it. It's got a good round, Frenchy flavor.
You get a little bit of cherry.
Uh-huh.
Some oak.
Yeah.
Something that's close to urine. We are sponsored today by Arbalest Wines. Not really. Sorry, please don't sue us. Just wanted you to know, Arbalest Winery, if you speak English, that the ranger on the cover of your wine bottle appears to be a level 33 noob. I figured you would want to know that and do a better job of picking a mascot.
It is good wine.
Indeed. Well, I was listening back to our old conversation, and I felt like it led us really well into today. Would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Welcome back to the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast, PPPP, if we decide to keep that name. I think it's working so far, hence the laughter. So last week, I'm sure everyone enjoyed, hopefully, our conversation about some of the fundamentals of philosophy. We kind of left off with overarching questions and began our narrative journey that we'll be exploring over the next few weeks. So this week, we're going to be talking about Socrates through the eyes of Xenophon, who, in my perspective, is the most important historical recorder of Socrates, as well as Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon, that is, who wrote the Great Instauration. I believe that's how you say it. If you go back and listen to our book club recording from that month, I butchered Instauration with all sorts of different pronunciations. So
That's okay. Sometimes you just got to be insaturated, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. In saturation.
Yes.
Ugh.
Well, there was one question that you answered last week. The question was, why do people ask about the theory of everything? And the question I would have for Jacob today is, what method do you think Stephen Hawking used when he was getting at the theory of everything? And this is a super basic question. Right?
Okay.
Some of the audience is probably think they has an answer right now. I think I have an answer, but I'm a layman scientifically, so I have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, I don't... It's weird because, there are several answers that come to mind that are pretty straightforward. I mean, the scientific method comes to mind.
Obviously.
Thinking centric is certainly kind of Hawking's method. He thought a lot
So
and
logic,
then wrote about it.
Systematic.
Yes, reasoning, working through implications as part of reasoning, I think, was maybe his main strength.
Yeah. Do you think he used syllogisms at all?
There
I
was
don't think
some of
so.
that, I think. Syllogisms tend to be a little on the weaker side, I guess, in terms of reasoning. But at the same time, they can find more creative answers, more creative ideas than what is more commonly found.
That's what I was thinking, is that the theory of everything as an idea is so creative that I wondered if there had to be a syllogism somewhere in there. And, I would have to do more research into the theory of everything, and if we were to get into it in its minutiae too much, we would probably go far afield. But one of the things you said about the scientific method is really apropos, because we verged up on this last time.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about how the scientific method as a concept seems to do a very good thing, and that it's the best thing we have. It's the best tool we've got.
In a way, yes.
What do you think some problems with observation might be? And I'm not trying to ask this to lie in wait for you with a club, because I'm going to admit right up the front to my audience and to you, I've got a list of problems I see with observation, which is one of the foundational things in the scientific method. But what do you think some problems might be? And we'll get to Sir Francis Bacon and Socrates on this, but let's maybe get what we think out of the way.
Sure. The obvious things come to mind are the common critiques of it, right? So there's only 5 senses. There's things we can't sense with our 5 senses. I think that's maybe where we were at last week in our conversation and talking about how we really can't understand anything that we can't perceive. And furthermore, another common issue is that different people perceive things differently, sense things differently. And so we really do have to rely on this kind of multitudinal, this large group of people observing the same thing and attesting to the same thing in order for our observations to be considered good. And so I think that's a weakness in and of itself, because you can't technically really just trust yourself. However, in the Descartesian, modern man method, where the thinking is the thing from which you build upon a philosophy, build upon finding truth, it's so self-centric that to rely on observation outside of yourself, the testimony of many other people, is a little bit contrary to the very method of self-reasoning, self-thinking. So,
and that's something that was really interesting about getting back into Sir Francis Bacon's great inspiration this week, because he admits to the problem of the individual's intellect.
Yeah.
Not being able to interpret the minutiae. And we can talk a little later about what his problem, his solution to that problem was. But it's interesting because it seems like the postmodern scientist's idea is that if we peer review everything, if we have a community of scientists surrounding these experiments and studies, then we can really get close to truth.
See, that's still a modernist approach. I don't think that the sciences, in their structure, have really embraced postmodernism. I think it's...
Oh, that's interesting.
It could be coming, but in terms of the structure that the sciences are currently using, we're still modernist, even though those structures were invented, much more recently. Especially
system,
peer review.
Everything about the college system feels like a modernist institution.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. Well, I guess then I will just tell the audience what we know about Sir Francis Bacon. I'll just read a series of quotes that might help us figure out some of the things he thought, and then later we can think about how Socrates contrasted with this. His goal and intent. Quote, "The requests I have to make are these. Of myself I say nothing, but in behalf of the business which is in hand, I entreat men to believe that it is not an opinion to be held, but a work to be done, and to be well assured that I am laboring to lay the foundation not of any sect or doctrine, but of human utility and power." Right away, what he's saying is so pertinent to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about how humans don't seem to have power to figure anything out. He believes right away humans should be able to have power of some kind.
Yeah.
That's just a very powerful thing to me.
Well, we do in a sense, because what we are figuring out, even though, admittedly we're kind of dancing around this thing, we're figuring things out, but we're also not figuring some things out. So the power that we have is to employ what we can figure out to build things. We aren't living in an insanely wealthy society for no reason, right? We're living in it because we've figured some things out that have made progress happen, that have made efficiencies happen, that has made this modern world happen, right? So,
then why is it that humans keep digging?
Yes.
There seems to be something in the human person to dig, even when an animal, for all intents and purposes, seems to get at what they're doing, get their meal, they fall asleep, they're happy.
Yeah. I like it. I like that question a lot. I think there's two answers. I think that these are both very important. The first answer is that we know we can still fail, and we want to mitigate against failure. Many people characterize this failure as a sort of existential crisis, as a sort of...
a lack of satisfaction.
Well, but more broadly, so we worry about that. We worry about this lack of satisfaction. What if we've achieved such decadence that we no longer know pleasure? Okay, so there's that. But the other side of this is, what if we wipe ourselves out? And so there's this reason for keeping on digging, as you put it, is that we want to mitigate against wiping ourselves out, wiping out the progress that we've seemingly made. And so part of that is like, let's go to the stars. Let's just go as far as we like. We need to figure out a new region of science that will enable us to have effectively superpowers compared to where we are now, as we have compared to where we were previously.
That could be why we love superhero comic books and superhero
In part,
movies.
I think so. We want to be them.
Something in there that we enjoy.
The second answer, though, which is more metaphysical, is that we aren't happy with who we are. No matter what we do as humans, we keep on digging because we don't like it. We don't like what we've done, who we are. And we'll get more into those sorts of things,
I
think, continuously throughout this.
I think that Jacob's comments really add to what Sir Francis Bacon said about the problem, because those two answers, coupled with Sir Bacon's summation of the problem, add not only the scientific edge to it, but also the spiritual edge to the problem. In his second quote, Sir Francis Bacon talks about his method for fixing the problem. Quote, "For certain it is that the senses deceive, but then at the same time they supply the means of discovering their own errors. Only the errors are here. The means of discovery are to seek." And that was interesting to me, because all at once that seemed like a hopeful message.
Yeah.
But also like somebody grabbing a bag and running out to a field and trying to catch the wind.
Yeah, it does seem a little like that. He's almost like he's saying our means by which we can discover things can be poisoned, can be intrinsically flawed to where they don't actually achieve anything, right? It's a bit of it's a really complicated statement, actually, that he's making there.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's so complex that it almost, to me, seems like he negates himself, because at one point he says the senses are good,
yeah,
and another, the senses are bad.
Huh.
That seems to defy a logical rule to me, and that might come up later.
Okay.
But that leads us to his problem. This is the quandary that he's dealing with. What's so funny is this is humbling to us, because we think we're dealing with this problem for the first time in postmodernism, but he's dealing with it all the way back then. He says, quote, "Upon the whole, therefore, it seems that men have not been happy hitherto, either in the trust which they have placed in others, or in their own industry, with regard to the sciences, especially as neither the demonstrations nor the experiments as yet known are much to be relied upon. For the universe to the eye of the human understanding is framed like a labyrinth. The way is still to be made by the uncertain light of the sense, sometimes shining out, sometimes clouded over, through the woods of experience and particulars," unquote. And that gets us to the idea of minutia we were talking about last time. It's so easy to get lost in the minutia. And if you don't know how the minute thing you were doing an experiment on relates to everything else, how can you necessarily prove that you know anything about the minute thing itself?
Yeah.
But that might be an interesting thing to discuss about an example, a minutia. The minutia I would put forward, and you're welcome to put forward any minutia you want as well, is the process of coming up with a vaccine.
Oh.
To come up with the current solution to the COVID-19 crisis. That's something that's difficult. Obviously, they use the scientific method when they're trying to come up with a vaccine, right? But here's the problem. Scope. How do you know that your vaccine is going to cover all of the permutations of this vaccine?
Of the virus, yeah.
Yeah, of the virus, yeah, absolutely. 2, how do you know you're even interpreting the virus's permutations correctly? What if somewhere in darkest Africa a permutation has come about that you are not aware of? Or what if another government is being throttled by a permutation of this virus and they don't know about it? So I'm just dipping my toe in the water. There's 2 things there. Well, really, there's just one thing, scope. The scope of a problem. We typically do an experiment when we want to solve a problem.
Right.
But then how do we know we are sufficiently seeing the scope?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question. I'm afraid the practical answer might be less interesting.
True.
Because practically speaking, we're using proven science, we could say, or tried and true methods in order to address vaccine creation. They do it every year. While it's never perfect, it's, effective generally.
Sure.
So, statistics and testing and research all join together in this effort to make a vaccine.
And that brings us right to one of the points on our list, verification.
Right.
I remember very well, I was standing up in front of a classroom teaching about music history.
Yeah.
And I point to the board, PowerPoint, and I say, Mozart lived in this era, he did these things, he was influenced by these philosophical ideas in his time period, he was a classical era composer, so he's influenced by the Enlightenment, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
A young lady raises her hand and says, how can I know any of the things you were saying are true?
She actually asked.
And I loved this moment because I could have a dialogue with this student that actually matters.
Wow.
About finding truth. But in all honesty, I didn't know how to tell her. All I could say is what we've said, that the community over years and years and years has preserved documents. You can go to Germany today, and although I have not seen these documents, I know they exist because the community tells me so.
Yeah.
That the original scores of Mozart and many other things of his own keeping still exist.
Yeah.
So she has to take my word.
Yeah. And it's fun, right?
Exist.
Because when it comes down to it, we're basically saying people generally tell truth. And I don't know that any of us really believe that.
We want to believe it. We really do.
But when it comes down to it, how many lies do we hear every day?
Yeah. There's lots of, I go to my Chrome
and so if there is a small number of people who actually can bear witness to the facts, it's extremely easy for them to be distorted. And this is, I think, extremely pertinent when we're talking about science. Because when it comes down to it, every PhD should be the utmost specialist in a subset of a specialized field.
True that.
And so that PhD student, that PhD graduate, is the expert when it comes to those facts. That means there's effectively, at least the potential for, only one person to understand something. Which means there's only one person who has to lie to you when it comes down to it. Now, if the academic system is doing its job, that shouldn't happen. But dramatic pause, because sometimes people don't do their jobs.
That's the human condition. Like we started at the beginning of the podcast, it's easy for us to see we aren't happy with who we are. There's something lacking, and we don't necessarily know what those things are that are lacking at any given time. And that's something that's interesting. Scope, we don't know how to necessarily define the problem perfectly. We don't know how to verify that the person who is giving us the information is actually telling the truth. My young lady, didn't know how to verify if I was telling the truth. And when I gave her what verification I had, it was based on third-hand, fourth-hand, fifth-hand information.
Yeah.
So, from a certain perspective, she was reasoning clearly, more clearly than anyone in the class. Which leads us to our second problem, interpretation of the data. We play telephone when we were kids.
Well, I think your student was engaging in critical thinking, right? Whatever that means.
Critical. I mean, just skeptic.
Straight up, yeah.
Like we talked about.
And so, this interpretation of the facts thing, we sort of have to be critical thinkers about it too in order to attempt any sort of reliability. But when it comes down to critical thinking, that too has its limitations because, like you're talking about, if we can't observe the facts for ourselves, our critical thinking hits a limit. We can't really understand. Like, we can only be so skeptical without observing everything for ourselves. And even then, when you apply critical thinking to yourself, as postmoderns are fans of doing, you can be, misobserving. You can have all sorts of problems with that process as well. So
that's why people go to therapy, because they applied critical thinking to themselves so much that they realize
there's some problems here.
And everybody who's intellectually honest will admit that. We're all
we need therapy.
We all need therapy.
Assuming it works, right? If we're not being critical,
assuming it isn't
thinking
a
about
scam.
that. No.
But see, that goes back to point number 3, interpretation and trust.
Yeah. Go on. These are good.
So point number 4 was communal influence, and you touched on this earlier.
Yeah.
The modernists / postmodernists have agreed that peer review and having a community of scientists and philosophers is absolutely essential to understanding truth about any given subject.
Right.
Whether it be birds migrate at this time of year or whatever. I mean, that's a simple thing it's so basic. I mean, you fill in any
So it's a good example, right? Yeah.
Any
of something
thing
that's maybe easy, maybe even trivial to observe.
Yeah.
And it's repeatable, and many people can observe it, and many people can document it, and so the scientific method works particularly well for that case. It's a good example of that.
That's the problem, though, because when it gets beyond things like birds migrate at this time of year, communal influence becomes even more powerful, I would assert.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you think that might affect data or the interpretation of data?
Well, one example that's fresh in my mind, I've been reading church history, and come the modern age, Descartes and after, we gradually let go of believing the Bible as truth. And what's happened there? Basically, there were a cacophony of difficulties with believing that it's actually truthful. And so, because it's not a repeatable thing, we can't go back and observe the facts of the matter, whether that's ancient Judaism, whether that's Christ's day, whether that's the insane visions and dreams and prophecies that occur all throughout. Because those aren't repeatable at all, there's issues with believing their validity. So, some of our listeners, as we are, maybe Christians, and have certain views about the truthfulness of the Bible, but when it comes down to it, this method contradicts it. This method says, no, we throw the Bible out. We have, German higher criticism that says, as a result of the modern thinking, we can't trust the Bible.
That's really good, because think about it. It's a shot in a million, and I understand anybody who has problems with this. It's a shot in a million that you would get the right books in the right order, at the right time, in the right form, without any corruption, in one place, to be able to say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I can trust what these people say.
Oh, yeah.
But think of it even more. We trust simple things like, we have problems trusting simple things like what our teachers say.
Yeah.
As we saw from that young lady. So I understand the reason.
I'm extremely sympathetic to anyone who doesn't believe the Bible. It's like, I agree. It's unbelievable.
It's difficult. It's very, very difficult to believe that. And I understand that from a reasonable point of view. And that really gets us to our thing there. Result variability. A lot of people do the same study. They do the same action, the same experiment, and it doesn't matter what they do, they get different results. Now, why that might be, I don't know. Again, I'm a layman scientifically. I didn't go to any sort of engineering or scientific school.
Yeah.
Why might somebody get different results when they're studying the same subject and supposedly using the same parameters of the experiment?
Well,
that's difficult.
When that does happen, though, the findings are thrown out in terms of science. If we have a significant variability, even if one person reliably finds something different using the supposed same methods, right? And there's investigations into what methods are used when, the whole thing gets thrown out.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people are probably wondering, what if the guy whose results varied had it right?
Yeah.
What if he had it right? And we'll never know. People talk about cancer research and cures to cancer. How do we know that there isn't a cure to cancer somewhere? This is getting a little bit of a tinfoil hat. I admit it to our audience right now. Tinfoil hat is going on. May he rest in peace. No. How do we know there isn't a cancer drug that helps people out there?
Yeah.
Now, I can't prove that. But is the question I'm asking the problem?
Yeah, I don't know either. Those sorts of questions, it's effectively skepticism about the systems that we've built. And I don't think that it's unhealthy. The systems that we build, I mean, we have to acknowledge when they do have flaws. We have to improve when we find those issues.
Okay, and this is where Sir Francis Bacon speaks with such strength. And this is something that I think the audience really needs to hear. His whole idea was that instead of the senses judging of minutia and particular observances in the order of the universe and the cosmos, instead of that, judge of the experiment. Well, then someone might say, we can't even judge the experiment well. And then Sir Francis Bacon says, well then, this is obviously a paraphrase, let us expunge the intellect by purging the philosophies, the demonstrations, and the course of natural human reason. Now, the reason I think that, the reason I seem to interpret this as being apropos is because he was skeptic back in his time period. And sciences had reached a halt up until that time. They'd gotten to a point where they were hitting a brick wall. They weren't getting anywhere. He writes a letter to the king and says, I would like to fix this. Here's the thing I'd like to establish with our sciences. So he asks questions. He critically thinks yet again. He's skeptic yet again. And he doesn't just become skeptic. He runs with it, and he gets other people to run in this skeptic course with him.
Yeah.
Skeptic against the Greek philosophers and all the things that have been founded on that. But I guess scientists for that time were Aristotle. And boom, look where we're sitting 400 years later. Now, that is a massive logical jump. You could make a claim that, okay, Brandon, you cannot say that one is related to the other.
Well.
But I would assert that maybe being skeptic again and being willing to throw out our old systems is the next step to human development. That's the problem. Nobody's done this. We're stepping on ground that people would say to Sir Francis Bacon in the 1600s, you are not only an idiot, you are a heretic. You are not only...
Because it was the 1700s, yeah.
You are not only an idiot and don't know what you're talking about, you need to be burnt at the stake.
Man, I mean, I wasn't expecting you to go there, but what in the world would it look like to throw out the structures on which we've been built? I mean, that's a lot.
We can talk about that a lot, and that would get us into big, hand-waving, theory-forming zones, and I love doing that, and I'm really trying really hard not to do it, but Socrates.
Okay.
He enters into all of this scientific dialogue and forward movement of humanity. These grand statements, the forward movement of human power and utility. We want to go to the stars. And then Socrates comes in and says, but justice. But living well.
Yeah.
But being humble.
Virtue.
And we're like, dang it, but I want to build a spaceship and go to Mars. It's like, what's the... what if Sir Francis Bacon and Socrates went to a bar and got a drink?
I was about to say...
What would they say to each other?
What would Socrates say to all this modernist progression, focused discussion? Would he actually be okay with our so-called scientific method?
That's what I'm asking you. That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah. I think it would be foreign to him for a start. But, honestly, I think what he'd say is, if you're a scientist, then be a good scientist. Yes. Do your science well. And live humbly and, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes. Socrates, in a sense, transcends our sort of understanding of philosophy and sciences and all of that, because it's so fundamental. I mean, it's just an understatement to say Aristotle was built upon Socrates. It's like, well, kind of. It's more like Aristotle is on a different level than Socrates.
He cared about different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that Socrates bears any similarities to any philosophers today, prominently?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not, as you've pointed out, we're laymen, we're not scientists, we're not philosophers. My inclination, and I know it's not contemporary, but it is to say actually Kant, oddly.
No.
Really? That's my inclination. And we'll talk more about Kant, months from now.
Absolutely.
What
about Jordan Peterson?
Oh.
The reason I say that is because
more
something
bugs.
you said.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility for virtue, for doing the right thing, taking responsibility for one personally, and not getting into these big sci-fi weeds of humanity must go beyond this planet because we're going to get out of our resources here and not have enough, and we're all going to die if we don't go to another planet, although that's important. Jordan Peterson says, take responsibility for your personal development. Take responsibility for your goodness.
Yeah.
Take responsibility for your mental health. Take responsibility for becoming the kind of person that you want to be. And that really just ties into what you said earlier about all of us not being happy with where we're at.
Yeah.
So if we don't talk about Socrates, Jordan Peterson seems to imitate a lot of that, and that might be why he has such credence, and why a lot of people listen to him for some time, because he offers a solution instead of trying to fix the entire world and take us to the stars.
Yeah. It's a personal, doable, achievable, addressable, approachable, all of those things.
Yeah.
Solution.
Seems doable.
And I think you might be onto something. That's certainly Socrates' approach as well. When he taught, when he spoke, when he gave lectures in the city square, reportedly he'd stand on a box, the soapbox, if you will, and speak. Who was he talking to? It's not like a current philosopher. It's not even like Kant, who I mentioned, who is mainly engaging in discussion with other philosophers. Socrates was talking to
normal people,
the layman. He was talking to himself, even. He was telling himself to live well.
That's interesting. Do you think that the modern scientific community or philosophical community emulates that?
No. Oh, that's an easy answer. No. If you read... Okay, so let's just think about this for a moment. If you had before you a box of 1 million academic papers, I'm sure there's
about that many.
Probably more than that, actually. 1 million... Yeah, there's got to be more than that. So, if you had the box of all the academic papers out there, and you picked one out of it and you looked at it, how many words in would you be before you got to jargon? How many words in would you be before not only jargon, say you had the definitions for everything there? Would you not comprehend what they were trying to say? Because there was so much built upon. They're referencing so much, other structure and things that's going on. I mean, 10 words, 20 words, genuinely, I don't think you'd get through the abstract.
Yeah, I would have to go to the library most likely and spend most of my time looking up books to define what's going on in the abstract, even after digging into the philosophical source material for about 2 years.
And anyone who's engaged in any sort of academia can bear witness to this. I'm in a master's program, and I have access to a library with probably millions of online resources, although I haven't searched. I haven't actually gotten the number. But anyways, when I search for something and start clicking on articles and seeing if it's what I'm looking for, I start reading those things and it's like, wait, you're saying what? What? I don't even understand in my own field what's going on.
Yeah, and that's a problem I could see coming up a lot, is you get into that position where one person emerges from the program who gets it.
Yeah.
And then they become the authority.
Ah.
Supposedly they get it, so we have to trust them.
Well, that goes back to my comment about PhDs being experts in their own fields. when you really understand something, I mean, you're preaching from on high at that point. Other people reference you, refer to you. You know, that's how academia works.
What's so interesting is here, the audience has probably been wondering up to this point, well, guys, how in the heck does any of this relate? But what has just happened is we found some of the problems with why people have problems with the scientific method in the first place. If we had 10 times more people standing up and engaging with people in the community about their content area, and not only do they know it well enough to explain it to each other, but they know it so well that they have to explain it to the entire community at large, I would assert there might be far less problems with observation and the scientific method.
Well, let's dive into that, because what would really happen there is that you would have a community of verification that's orders of magnitude larger. Because everyone who's actually, let's say that everyone who was interested in listening to you as a writer, as a thinker, did, then all of them would be able to verify your work by their own observation, by their own scientific method. Whereas right now, all that we have is the people who are effectively you, on that same level. The people very close to you, surrounded by you, peers of you, and how many of them are actually interested. Because even they have barriers to overcome when it comes to the jargon issue, when it comes to the, issue of you're the only expert in that field. And maybe I'm being a little too imprecise when I'm saying you're the only expert in that field, because of course there's thousands of experts in every field. But again, my comment on this subfield issue, where it's like, PhDs are supposed to be the authority when it comes to a certain thing. I'm using that as a characterization of science at large. I'm not just saying that that's the issue. I'm saying that if you take a fragmentation of that and look at where that principle applies throughout all of academia and beyond. I'm not even just saying academia. I'm saying throughout the whole world of thought. Although maybe in the modern day, most of that's academia. But anyways.
Because you could argue that Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, many other folks of their cloth get into the weeds and really try to communicate with people who go to Barnes & Noble and get a small latte from the Starbucks off the edge there.
And we would say, great, good. Because now what's going on, there's more criticisms of a Hawkins and a Dawkins and whoever else you mentioned than there are of anyone else. Because they've actually put themselves out there and willingly accept that.
And that's interesting because they're almost like the tip of the iceberg. There might be tons of other people who have better arguments below them. Or even worse arguments. We don't know because those people haven't shown themselves. For all we know.
And revealed themselves to criticism, which makes progress.
Yeah.
Because when we can look at a Dawkins or a Hawkins and make really good arguments about why maybe what they said wasn't right, or a different route that has sprung to our mind as a result of reading the routes they've gone down, then we really have made progress.
And that brings us to an interesting... I have only 2 more points left. Problems with observation. Parameter control, I feel, is related to the issue of Socrates because he draws the parameter in a very small circle.
Yeah.
That circle goes around oneself. That's it.
Yeah.
And his parameter of his study is that he's studying himself. He wants to be a thriving, flourishing human being, so his parameter doesn't necessarily go into, is everything made of water? Is everything made of fire? Many of the other things that the Greek philosophers prior to him and after him studied. Instead, his parameters are simply, what is the best Socrates?
Yeah.
But here's the problem. Some studies claim to study the same things, but cannot recreate the exact conditions from study to study, or experiment to experiment. Thus, who's to say the results are equivocal? This is super meta, because they can apply to experiments and also to people, because people would need an infinite amount of situations to prove that they are infinitely good. But our lives
That is
don't go on
interesting.
infinitely, so we can never be infinitely good, but we want to be, I would assert, infinitely good.
Yeah.
At which point, Sir Francis Bacon would call me an idiot for getting stuck in these absolute
Infinitudes.
infinitudes and ridiculous, meaningless statements. But parameter control is a big thing, even for experiments.
Yeah.
And that probably could fall underneath scope. But the last point I had, if you don't have anything to say about that one,
Yeah, go on.
inadequate tools
Mm.
to successfully observe.
I mean, this one has some really obvious things to comment on. So the assumption in science is that if we don't have the tools available now to make the observations that we need to make in order to progress, then we will build them. We will eventually have them. We will gradually grow to acquire them. And I think this has worked. I think this has worked okay. I mean,
we definitely have some cool...
We certainly have some
tools.
insane scientific marvels and masterpieces.
The whole God particle reactor.
Yeah.
How we found that thing. It was pretty amazing.
The Large Hadron Collider. I mean, those sorts of achievements are unbelievably advanced and attribute, such a wonderful tribute to human ingenuity, I think. But regardless, that's the assumption. The assumption that we will eventually have these tools. And my question, because I don't quite know the answer, but my question is, when does that fall apart, or does that fall apart? This might go back to what I was commenting on even last week about how observation does not extend into metaphysics. When it comes down to it, we can't build tools to observe metaphysics, right? That's kind of the point of calling it metaphysics. It's not, it's, sub-physics. If it's physics, then we can observe it. If it's metaphysics, then it's not, we can't.
Yeah.
So what would you say on that? When does that fall apart?
That's an interesting question, and I think we're both getting at the same direction here, and that's why this works, because I think we're going to find the more we dig into this, the problem is going to stay the same. The problem is honestly what Sir Francis Bacon said, which is that human reason and human utility has been lacking up until the 1600s. We have asserted, and many others have asserted, it's been lacking up till now. And at some point, you have to question, is it only the metaphysical things that we're having trouble perceiving, or is it even the physical things?
Well, it's certainly the physical things as well. That's why there is such a field as theoretical physics. It has to be theoretical because we can't observe it. So
we just say these things have to exist because we've seen this happen. How does that happen? We don't know. So for that to happen, we think this must exist.
Yeah, we're building mathematical models of physics. So it's an abstract which we are using to build a tool of description.
We can't even describe it. I hope that blows everyone's minds right now in the audience. It is so indescribable and deep and rich and glorious that we have to build an abstract of an abstract to make a description.
That's why we enjoy the idea of physics. Like,
that's powerful.
It's beautiful, it's
that
just
so...
Yeah, layers.
Yeah, layers on layers on layers.
All right, so was that your last?
That was my last point. And,
so we have gone through and, continuing on last week's theme, evaluated the merits of observation and to what extent, or maybe lack thereof, can we use observation as a means for actually understanding truth, right? Mm-hmm. So building on that then, I think next week we're going to take a little bit of a shift from this sort of observation-based truth-seeking to reasoning-based truth-seeking. Next week we'll be discussing Plato, especially in the context of his book Gorgias.
Indeed.
Or Gorgias. I'm not sure how professionals say that.
I've heard it
said. Gorgias, but anyways, it's not spelled gorgeous, but regardless. And Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan, maybe the father of modern law, might be his title.
Indeed.
So, In both cases, though, the reason this pairing works is because they're both using this idea of human reasoning as a means of seeking truth. They don't so much care about this observational realm that we've been discussing the last 2 weeks.
Think about it almost as personal responsibility times 10. What if we could get an entire society to be personally responsible and to fit into a unified framework, a culture, a country underneath a ruler? This has been the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast with Jacob Murdoch and Brandon Moore. We've enjoyed having you today. Please keep asking these great questions with us. Good night.